Hey folks, so let's discuss the 12th house today, the psychological processes of the 12th house. And so in this podcast, we will emphasize when the 12th house is highlighted in a significant way. So I'm thinking, for example, when Saturn is transiting the 12th house, or the progress moon is in the 12th house. And this is not an exhaustive account of the psychological occurrences and activities in the 12th house, but it's meant to give a kind of guiding framework for us to meaningfully discuss what goes on when the 12th house is highlighted. So, of course, some of what is said here will naturally apply to natal placement in the 12th house, but the emphasis here with this podcast is really thinking about what happens when we walk into the 12th house as an evolutionary stage, what we encounter as we walk into the 12th house, what the 12th house means in terms of the psychological activity that we are undertaking as we step into the dimension that is symbolically described by house 12. So that's the focus here today. So let's find a useful starting point to try to discuss all of this. So the 12th house is, as we know, the final house in the progression of houses. So the 12th house cues us into this idea of the ending of a cycle. So some sort of inner psychic process of ending. So psychically, what is being tied up, the loose ends that are being tied up, and this being a necessary process to enter the next phase. So it's an emptying out of, let's say, psychic residue that can't be carried into the next cycle, an emptying out of certain patterns and material within the psyche, patterns that represent frequencies of awareness that you are meant to move beyond, because these patterns would trip you up, so to speak. So patterns that represent old cycles of consciousness, old patterns within the soul record. And so when we've reached to a 12th house stage by a major transit or progression, so we're thinking Saturn transit or the progress moon, it's letting us know that we are at a point of completing our cycle in the frequencies of consciousness that we are now being asked to release and to empty out. And so it's the 12th house, archetypally linked with the sign of Pisces, a water sign. And so this is a water house. So this would draw our attention to the fact that much of the activity that takes place in this house is on an inner, psychic, emotional, subtle, energetic, and spiritual level. So much of the activity that's taking place in this house is taking place at an unseen level. So the 12th house is a house where there is a lot of inner, less overt activity at psychic and inner emotional and energetic levels. And so the activity of the 12th house is far less overt than the first house, which follows. And so if it is the end of a cycle, symptomatically we can experience things like confusion, being disoriented, a sense of not being able to hang on to the certainties and structures that informed and gave meaning to our lives up to that point. So I'm confused, I'm disoriented, and even afraid, because increasingly I'm unable to find my footing on the old structures of my life. So the 12th house is a place of subtle activity. So when the 12th house is being highlighted or emphasized by transit or progression, there is a subtle process happening, very significant, but also very subtle. So with the 12th house, and in fact with any of the water houses, the more in tune you are with your own inner world, the more you will be able to sense what's happening within you. And in fact, to be able to feel and to sense what's happening within you when the 12th house is highlighted by, as we said, by transit or by progression, it's a good time to do things that encourage your ability to hear your inner voice. So things like being in quietude. So in fact, as the 12th house becomes activated by transit or by progression, you very often will naturally find yourself drawn to activities that allow you to retreat into your own inner world, your inner sanctuary. So when the 12th house is highlighted, this is a symbolic way of understanding that retreat and solitude are necessary at this point on your evolutionary schedule for certain psychic processes within you to be accomplished. And so when house 12 is highlighted, this is a way of understanding that on deeper levels, your psyche is requiring of you a retreat into your own inner world. So you would be naturally drawn into periods of more solitude so that the necessary psychic activity can take place within the psyche. So this kind of emptying out, this dissolution of past patterns within you as you prepare for the next first house phase, as let's say Saturn would then traverse into house 1, or the progress moon would go into house 1. So this dissolution of past patterns as you prepare for the next first house phase. So an emptying out of old psychic residue so that foundations for your identity, new foundations for your identity, first house, can be created. So especially with Saturn going through house 12 and moving into house 1, well, this period of time in which Saturn would traverse the 12th house and cross the ascendant into house 1, it is a critical point of transition. So Saturn in house 12, coming to terms with the emptying out process, facing what has been held in the recesses of the psyche. So deep, concentrated reflection, spiritual maturation relative to these old psychic patterns. And that is the preparatory phase for a reconstitution, that's Saturn, a reconstitution of your identity, first house. So the beginning of crystallizing your identity on new terms, initiating, that's first house, initiating the formation and crystallization, that's Saturn, of a new identity, first house, that emerges out of the processes of the 12th house. So yes, as we were saying, being sensitive to your inner psychic dynamics and your own feelings will help you to grasp some of the processes of the 12th house, or what's happening within you as the 12th house is highlighted. But we have to add another caveat here, somewhat paradoxically, because even the most inwardly aware of us may still have a challenging time fully grasping what's happening within us when the 12th house is highlighted. The 12th house is a domain of activity which is often oriented away from our conscious mind focus. In other words, the 12th house is often about deeper psychic processes which are taking place beyond the conscious mind, but which are certainly impacting or waking conscious experience. So the inner self is processing, the inner self is gathering its things at a level of experience which is somewhat removed from the usual conscious mind framework of understanding. So the inner psyche is preparing the personality, the conscious personality, for a new phase, working at these deeper psychic levels to clear out, to drain out, as we said, these old psychic remnants that are not appropriate for the next phase of life as the transiting planet or progress planet enters the first house. So as the 12th house is active, other more subtle parts of your overall consciousness are being more fully engaged. A lot of activity is taking place at subtler portions of your consciousness, and subtler from the standpoint of the everyday waking mind. In other words, what we're saying is that these processes are only subtle to the extent that your normal everyday consciousness tends to be oriented away from these more inner dimensions of activity. So when house 12 is active or emphasized, it's a time when the inner self, the interior psychic self, is making itself more known to you. You tend to become more aware of the interior dimensions of yourself, who you are. So what we might describe as the deeper, intangible inner soul and spiritual dimensions of who you are. And very often, a way in which the interior psychic dimensions of your being announce themselves to you is by presenting you with data and information which is often at odds with what you consciously believe or consciously understand. So the conscious mind tends to understand things at one level. The inner self, we could say, knows far more or has a broader scope of understanding. So your inner self knows what's coming down the pike and subtly, almost imperceptibly, guides your conscious personality. So one day you find yourself going somewhere for no real reason. Perhaps you just felt like taking a drive, and then when you arrive at your destination, you meet someone who ends up being very important to you. The idea of the right place at the right time. So the interior psychic self guides the conscious self because it knows that meeting this person is an experience that you need to have, and because it knows what's coming down the pike, because it can see further down the timeline than the conscious personality can, and so it guides the personality. So a 12th house process, especially as we said, when the 12th house is highlighted by a major transit, say Saturn, or by progression, the progress moon, a 12th house process involves creating more of a bridge or a link to the inner self and a deeper connection to the intangible soul and spiritual dimensions of who you are. So to continue, for example, your inner self may communicate certain data and information to you through dreams, intuitions, and feelings. And the information, because it is precognitive, may be at odds with what your conscious mind knows or can appreciate. So when the 12th house is active, it can bring into, let's say, a sharper awareness the differences between the conscious portions of your awareness and the deeper, more interior portions of your awareness, where the dreaming self resides. So it can bring into sharper awareness the 12th house processes. They can bring into sharper awareness an understanding of things happening at more unconscious levels. So your unconscious activity becoming somewhat more conscious. So when the 12th house is activated by a major transit or progression, in general terms, your energy and focus would more actively be directed toward exploring or interfacing with these more unconscious domains of your experience, the unconscious domains of who you are, the other portions of your awareness. So you may begin to have a stronger appreciation that there are deeper parts of you than what you've been consciously aware of. So you could experience things like your intuition and inner feelings, the inner interior parts of yourself conveying to you things that they might seem outlandish. They might seem outlandish from the perspective of your conscious mind. So your inner self is communicating to you through your intuition, your intuitive knowing, but the conscious mind often has no framework for how that data may rationally make sense according to its standards of logic, according to its standards of proof. And so this is the kind of process that often happens when the 12th house is active. So from that standpoint, we begin to see that we have two psychological attitudes that become very important to guide us through 12th house experiences. One is the psychological attitude of trust, inner trust, trust perhaps in some higher power. The classic idea of letting go and letting God. I don't understand this, so I'm going to have to surrender my conscious personality understanding of this to something bigger and more all-encompassing. So 12th house experiences often ask us, for whatever reason, to let go and to let God, or whatever your framework is of some sort of higher power. So we are involved in a psychological process of surrendering and letting go. So the second psychological attitude that is often necessary to navigate through 12th house experiences is the idea of being in the flow. To go along with the current, the tide of where things are going, to allow yourself to be led downstream without trying to resist, to suspend your need to force things through your limited conscious understanding, to not force action, but to wait for when it's clear that it's the right time to act. So waiting is characteristically a 12th house activity. There are processes unfolding within your psyche and being that simply cannot be rushed. So you must wait. So in 12th house experiences, we often have to surrender ourselves to the fact that we are not in control of a situation in our lives, that a higher order logic has to assemble all the component parts of a given situation in our lives in order to bring about resolution. So we have to sort of learn to be the passenger in the car, so to speak, and to be driven to our destination, because there is some portion of ourselves, the inner psyche, that knows the best route, or route, as you Americans would say. So when the 12th house is activated or highlighted by transit or by progression or both, it's not just describing a set of experiences, but it's telling you about the appropriate attitudes to have at the moment. It is a prescription for the kinds of psychological attitudes that are needed for your current moment. So when in Rome, do as the Romans do. When in the 12th house, act according to the customs of the 12th house. And 12th house customs are surrender, waiting, being in the flow, non-resistance, attitudes of trust. And so when we think about this astrologically, we can sort of appreciate the deeper logic of why the planet Jupiter was designated as the traditional ruler of Pisces and would belong to the overall archetypal matrix of Jupiter, Pisces, and the 12th house. Because Jupiter, on one level of its expression, has to do with your beliefs, how you interpret the world, the interpretive framework of meaning that you impose onto the world, and your place inside of it. So your worldview. So a Jupiter verb would be to believe, to interpret. Or verbs, plural, would be to believe, to interpret. So when we go through 12th house experiences, they often bring into sharp focus what our essential beliefs are. Do we have a structure of belief that facilitates this idea of surrender, waiting, being in the flow, and trust? Because 12th house times are times that often highlight your most deeply held beliefs about the nature of reality. Do I believe, for example, that there is a part of me that knows more than my everyday conscious mind, and that this part of me can be relied on to guide me? So someone with that sort of belief structure or system may find it a bit easier to ride through 12th house experiences. In fact, what often happens is that 12th house periods, these periods often provide us with experiences that are important for expanding or restructuring our beliefs about reality, our spiritual beliefs. So through certain experiences, we cultivate a deeper metaphysical understanding, and we define our spiritual orientation much more, especially as Saturn goes through that house, the 12th. So when house 12 is highlighted by progression or transit, very often it's almost like we're forced to develop some deeper appreciation for the metaphysical dimensions of life, to connect to deeper sources of spiritual sustenance. So through certain experiences, we are forced almost to grow spiritually and to cultivate inner spiritual strength. And we'll talk about the idea of spiritual strength, inner spiritual strength, in just a moment. So you might pause for a minute to think about your general orientation to the 12th house as a domain of experience. So are you, for example, resistant to entering the 12th house? Are you resistant to developing a rapport with these metaphysical dimensions, the interior, the inner psychic dimensions of your own being? What does your 12th house look like? What is your relationship with it? Because your pre-existing orientation to this domain of your life will condition how you experience the 12th house when it is highlighted by transit or by progression. And so yes, because there is an emptying out, a psychic emptying out, a central process of the 12th house is going through the void, an empty, liminal, transitional phase between your old personality structure of identity and the new one that is being formed or built as Saturn or the progress moon enters the first house. So I have a book in my library. It's called Spiritual Growth, and it's a 12th house kind of title, and I've taken out a short excerpt to read to you. So let's grab that. And here it goes. It says, "The void is a state of consciousness you can go into to expand beyond your current limits, to let go of old things, and to move to your next level of growth. In the void, you leave behind familiar structures, habits, thoughts, behaviors, and attitudes, and go deep within to create new ones that match your higher vibration." So let's go one more time. The void is a state of consciousness you can go into to expand beyond your current limits, to let go of old things, and to move to your next level of growth. In the void, you leave behind familiar structures, habits, thoughts, behaviors, and attitudes, and you go deep within to create new ones that match your higher vibration. And so this excerpt goes to the heart of the 12th house in such a profound way. The 12th house is the state of consciousness, the dimension you go into to let go of old things, old attachments, to leave behind familiar structures, habits, thoughts, and behaviors, to let those things dissolve, to let the old cycles of consciousness, the old residues dissolve. And so the 12th house is a state of consciousness in which you go deep within. So when house 12 is emphasized by transit, by progression, there is a lot to be gained by going inward. So a central activity, a central custom of the 12th house is reflection. There is a lot to be gained by activities like reflection, being still, allowing insight, especially about your past, to come up. Doing things to slow down your brainwave cycles. Things like reverie, to allow certain data from the inner self to make itself known to your conscious awareness. So you do things like you slow down the brainwave cycles through things like reverie. So let's talk about the idea of inner spiritual strength. So what is less emphasized, what tends to be less emphasized when house 12 is highlighted by transit or by progression, is that it can be a tremendously rewarding time of cultivating inner spiritual strength, meaning especially with Saturn going through house 12, it can be a rewarding time of really solidifying the inner spiritual sources of your strength. The inner spiritual sources of your strength. And so shoring up your inner spiritual resources, which would tend to result in more confidence and faith in yourself and in life itself. So deep inner realizations which anchor you in a strong, sturdy, inwardly strong sense of spiritual fortitude. Now, it's interesting, as a kind of experiment, you might find it curious to observe the words you use in daily life as your 12th house is highlighted by transit, by an important transit, say Jupiter or Saturn, or by progression, the progress moon. So I realized that as I look back through some old journals, that in 12th house times, I kept on using the terms peace, inner sanctuary, calm, phrases like in the eye of the storm, terms and phrases that speak to cultivating the calm, inner spiritual solitude and strength that is so characteristic of the 12th house, and that's often so necessary to navigate a 12th house time. So perhaps you pay attention to what your own words are conveying to you about the 12th house activities taking place within you. So these are a few things to consider, to think about, to help you to make sense of a 12th house time, a framework of sorts to help you characterize your experiences and the processes, the psychic and evolutionary processes that take place as you are in the 12th house, as a dimension of experience, as a state of consciousness, the 12th house as a state of consciousness and as a dimension. Alright, so reminding you as usual that I'm available for a range of private astrological counseling and teaching consultations, and links to that are in the description box below the video, where you'll also find links to other astrological resources that you might find helpful. So until next time, talk soon. Bye.